Ah, have you just arrived? How very unusual. Just how long has it been? Rejoice, my new friend, for this is a true haven of the forlorn, the cold and gentle painted world of Ariandel. Quick, go along. Find one for yourself. A sweetly rotting bed to lie upon.
I am a From Software fanatic. I've played all of the Soulsborne games multiple times, though I can't say the same about most of the Armored Core games, so maybe I'm just a Miyazaki fanatic. 3 of my top 10 favorite games of all time are FromSoft games, with Bloodborne specifically being my number 1. Yes, I know in my Sekiro video I said that Sekiro was my favorite game of all time, but I also recall admitting how inconsistent I am with that opinion. However, for a long while now, Bloodborne has held that spot at number 1, even while the other positions shifted around it, and I think it's gonna stay that way. Like the nucleus at the center of the atom or a gimp at an orgy. My point is, when it comes to FromSoft games, I'm quite experienced and I know my shit. I know all the obscure things that even Souls veterans don't know. That's right, the darkest secrets of these games. I know what Ornstein did in Archdragon Peak. I know who the furtive pygmy is. I know the Firekeeper's cup size. I know why they call him Big Hat Logan. I know all of this because I watch VaatiVidya. Dark Souls 3, despite being popular with new and old Souls fans alike, and despite many people sharing similar critiques and praises of the game even with differing overall views, is a game that I feel is misunderstood, both by the people that love it and the people, at least the people in the Souls community, that criticize it. It's a game that I feel is loved and hated for all the wrong reasons. Though it should be pretty obvious from my introduction when I think about it, I'll say I love Dark Souls 3. I mean, I love every FromSoft game. Not you. What do I think of Dark Souls 3 myself? Well, obviously the rest of the video will be mostly about that, but I will say that I think it is by far the best Dark Souls game, though I definitely don't consider it to be the best FromSoft game. Just to preface all this, I'll say Dark Souls 3 was, in fact, my first Souls game ever. That's right, I am not a Demon Souls boomer, nor a Dark Souls soy jack, and I'm certainly not racist. I followed Dark Souls 3 with Dark Souls, then Dark Souls 2, then Bloodborne, then Sekiro, then Elden Ring, then lastly, ironically, was Demon Souls, the PS5 remake. I never played the original. Go ahead, laugh at me, I'm young enough where you'll die first, cope harder. I just figured I should at least mention that I started with Dark Souls 3, because it will probably make some of my viewpoints later in the video make a bit more sense. Let's get down to brass tacks. If Dark Souls 3 is so misunderstood by its devout players, why is that? Well, we should start by simply taking a look at what people think of Dark Souls 3. Step 1, the lovers. What do people love about Dark Souls 3? Well, the obvious answer is the bosses. It wouldn't exactly be a hot take if you were to claim that Dark Souls 3 had the best boss roster of the Souls games. I mean, it's kind of hard to refute. You've got Gundyr, the Abyss Watchers, Pawn of Sullivan, the Twin Princes, the Soul of Cinder. This game is fucking stacked, though I think Sekiro's bosses are better, just saying. Now, this in and of itself isn't a misunderstanding, and arguing that Dark Souls 3's bosses aren't incredible both from a gameplay and story standpoint is a pretty stupid argument to make. It's like arguing that BioShock isn't artistic, or that The Outer Wilds isn't, albeit unintentionally, a horrifying experience. Despite having a couple of stinkers, see the Curse-Rotted Greatwood and the Catholic Church, the game's bosses are pretty hard to complain about. I think the misunderstanding here is actually the bosses themselves, of FromSoft games at least. If you commit the cardinal fucking sin of interacting with the Souls community within the bounds of the actual nightmare plane of existence, the Shadow Realm akin to hell itself, you know, Reddit, you might be led to believe that the bosses are the most important part of From Software's games. And I have a newsflash for that crowd. The bosses of Souls games are the bonus, the last bit of quality seasoning that helps solidify these games as masterpieces, but they are not the main ingredient. Think of a Souls game as a really good cake. The bosses are not the cake itself. I'd argue they aren't even the frosting. They're the sprinkles on top. The levels are the cake itself, and I'd argue the design of the world is the frosting, since those are the parts of the game you'll be interacting with the most. To claim that the bosses of a Souls game are what make it great is to ignore like 95% of the damn game. And the problem with Dark Souls 3 is that when you view it as that cake, the actual cake itself, which is to say the levels, it's not it. Before I continue, I'll say I actually don't hate Dark Souls 3's levels as much as many of the old school Souls fans I've seen criticizing them, and unlike a lot of them, I actually like the aesthetics of the game. I see a lot of people complain about how washed out and gray everything looks, but I personally think it adds to the atmosphere more than anything. However, Dark Souls 3's levels are problematic. For one, it feels very linear. I'm not going to say anything on how linear it actually is, because every Souls game, excluding Elden Ring, is only non-linear to a fault. That said, no other Souls game feels as linear as Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne are both games that have limited open design when you really think about it, but it never feels that way when you play through those games. It's kind of hard to explain, but if you've played through all these games, you probably know what I'm talking about. I never feel constrained strolling through the undead burg or walking through the streets of Yharnam. Even though the paths through these games are mostly actually on a track, clever use of shortcuts, interwoven layouts, and just general good map design makes the player feel less like a mouse being led through a maze and more like a knight or a hunter who's just going where they want to go. Dark Souls 3 never feels like this. I'm not a level designer. I don't know what the exact reason is for this problem. I may not understand how a game's design affects my perception of it, but I do know what my perception of it is, and I know that that perception exists because of how the game was designed. Honestly, so many levels in this game just feel shitty. The Undead Settlement, the Swamp, and Farron Keep, Karthus, the Profaned Capital, most of the levels in Dark Souls 3 are either mid as hell or just downright bad. And even levels I like overall, like Irithyll or Archdragon Peak, I mostly just like them for their aesthetics and bosses. Dark Souls 3 is the Souls game which I run through the most shit. I never find myself fighting through even the areas I like just cause they're a massive pain in the ass. Now, you might be saying, well that's just your experience and it's totally subjective, and to that I say, yeah bitch, it's my video. There's only one area in all of Bloodborne that I consistently run through, and that's the Forbidden Woods. And even then, I explore it on New Game for the upgrade materials. In Dark Souls 3, the only area I don't run through is the High Wall of Lothric, I think? When a game makes me want to entirely skip the biggest portion of its content, that's a very bad thing. There are many reasons why Dark Souls 3's levels feel this way, one of which is that linear thing I talked about earlier. The other is the enemies. It seems to me like every enemy in Dark Souls 3 falls into one of two extreme categories. You can either R1 spam through them without even thinking about it, or it feels like a full-fledged boss fight and not in a good way. Very few mobs in this game would fall outside of these two archetypes, which is pretty damn irritating, and it makes the levels just feel worse. It's hard to love the levels of this game when you not only feel constrained and railroaded, but on top of that, every foe you face is either a toddler with a pool noodle or Mike fucking Tyson. Now, I could go super deep into the combat, but I feel like that's something everyone kinda understands. It's pretty damn good and fun. It still plays in the style of Dark Souls, but it's more up to the speed of Bloodborne. The only thing I will always say is that as fun and as funny as it is, being able to spam dodge to get out of most situations is a bit ridiculous at times, but I think the boss fights specifically use the combat and it shines really well there. Me when a girl's giving me hints. Now let's go with something I see criticized a lot, mostly from Souls veterans, the reuse of Dark Souls 1 shit. Now on one hand, I kinda get where this comes from. For all the issues I, and many others, have with Dark Souls 2, it did kind of set a certain expectation for Dark Souls sequels. That being that the sequels wouldn't contain too many strong connections to the previous games. Sure, Drang Lake is technically built on top of Anor Londo in the lore, but it's made clear that it's far from the first Kingdom to be in that position. Dark Souls 2 is very disconnected from Dark Souls 1, and while I certainly don't think it absolves the game of all its sins, it is the reason why plenty of Souls fans were disappointed when they saw how many things Dark Souls 3 took from Dark Souls 1. Anor Londo, the stray demon, Gwyn being used in the Soul of Cinder fight, Karth and Frampt, Ornstein, though Dark Souls 2 did that too, Firelink Shrine, and even Andre. There's a lot of shit in this game that comes directly from the first game. And a bunch of angry gamers raged about how fan servicey the game was. How dare FromSoft try to play with our nostalgia? How dare they try to capitalize on our memories? Thing is, as crazy as this sounds, I don't think these reuses were actually intended to be fan service. Developers I have genuine faith in are nearly extinct. In the AAA scene, there used to be 3, and now there's only 2. And FromSoft more than earned its place there. There aren't a lot of studios who have shown me enough artistry and goodwill for me to give them the benefit of the doubt in this way, but the people who made this game are absolutely one of them. The reuses were not done for the sake of being fan service. Well, maybe Gwyn's theme in the final encounter, but other than that, I really don't think so. Because look at what all these reuses are. They aren't just taken straight out of the original game, they're broken, falling, rotting. They are shown to us in such a state of disrepair and sickness, and I think the developers weren't just being lazy or try to play with players' hearts. I think this was them telling us, the players, to move on. Miyazaki, the director of every Souls game other than Dark Souls 2, stated that he didn't really want Dark Souls to have multiple sequels, and that it wasn't really the point of the series. But I think Dark Souls 3 is where that sentiment was actually conveyed in the strongest way imaginable. Anor Londo, rotting and overtaken, now home only to a god-devouring slug. The serpent's monuments, but they themselves are nowhere to be found. The stray demon, alone and weakened, with not even a single spark of the chaos flame remaining within. FromSoft put these things in front of the players who kept begging for sequels, begging FromSoft to make more and more Souls, and asked, is this really what you want? And that brings me to the final great misunderstanding of Dark Souls 3, which is Dark Souls 4. I'm not going to pretend that no part of me is wishing for more FromSoft all the time. Believe me, I get it. But I can't help but feel like a lot of the people who are asking for things like Bloodborne 2 or Dark Souls 4 haven't really stopped to ask, why do I love these games so much? Well, maybe on a surface level. For example, I love Bloodborne because of the cosmic horror elements, or I love Dark Souls 3 because of these bosses. But I think the real thing that makes these games so amazing is that there's always a point. Every FromSoft game has a reason to exist. They are all art. They all feel like the developers loved them, and they all ooze with detail, creativity, and passion. FromSoft is a rare studio that makes a lot of games, but somehow all of those games feel so complete and meaningful. They all feel like they have a reason to be here, and like the developers had a clear and impactful vision that they executed on. And that's because the people at FromSoft are creatives. They want to create things. They want to try new things and toy with ideas, throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. They aren't a soulless factory line. So why are so many people asking them to be? Why do so many people seem to think that more equals better? I mean, come on, have we not learned our lesson? Look at Assassin's Creed, look at Gears of War, look at Call of Duty. We've seen so many franchises kill themselves by playing it safe, by sticking to what works, and just letting stagnation take hold. Why do you want Dark Souls to end up the same way? FromSoft isn't a studio that milks games, they're a studio that became incredibly successful by just making great games. Isn't this what we want? Isn't this the exact thing that most of the gaming industry is missing? The biggest misunderstanding of Dark Souls 3 is tragic, because it seems that the point of the game, the main message that the game was trying to impart, was lost on many people. Ironically, many of the people who love it the most. I'm not saying you're a bad person if you want Dark Souls 4, of course not. And I'm definitely not saying you aren't a true fan or whatever, because that would just be a stupid thing to say. But I am saying this. If you want Dark Souls 4, then you did miss the point of Dark Souls 3. And the entire Dark Souls trilogy, if I'm being honest. It was always a message warning you about what it means to embrace stagnation, what the consequences are for fighting change, the irreparable damage that refusing to leave your comfort zone and journey into the unknown can cause. And no offense to all the people who want endless sequels, because I get where you're coming from, but I'm really glad From Software doesn't seem to be listening. I'm glad they have real creatives who seem to be in charge, not business executives trying to make a quadruple A game. Jesus Christ, Ubisoft continues to amaze me. You may not realize it, but this is what you're asking FromSoft to turn into. This is what you want Dark Souls to become. You're asking FromSoft to do exactly what Dark Souls is warning people not to do. Dark Souls 3 is an amazing game. It, like its fellow Souls games, is a game I adore and hold in extremely high regard. I consider the Souls games to be, hands down, the greatest games ever made. I believe they use the power of video game storytelling better than any other series, and it's not even close. I believe their combat, their environments, their enemy and boss designs and soundtracks are all so worthy of high praise, and I believe that they show people what video games are truly capable of. But I also believe that things have to end. I believe that far too many stories are ruined by not knowing when to stop. At a certain point, an idea needs to be let go of, not milked dry until there's nothing left. Dark Souls should be left alone. Bloodborne should be left alone. And after Shadow of the Erdtree, I hope Elden Ring is left alone, so that the people at FromSoft can start working on amazing new games and ideas that they have yet to explore. FromSoft doesn't want an eternal age of fire. They want to let the fire fade and go off into the age of darkness. They want to let things change, and I admire that, because change is scary. And if all you've ever known is the light, then darkness is scary too. But they are one of the only developers I and many others will gladly follow into that darkness. And I am eager to see what places they take us to next. This video was late, the next one will be on time, I swear. It happened once because I had a lot of shit to do, so I moved this video back a week. Bi-weekly uploads are my plan from here on out, and I will have the next video out in that time frame, despite the fact that Final Fantasy is currently taking over my life. I know it's a wee bit cringe to shout it out in the video, but if you're still watching, consider following me on Twitter. I basically just shitpost most of the time, but I do also give updates on what my next video is going to be, so that's something. But regardless, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching.